It's a joy to be with you this evening. It snuck up on me a little bit. 18 months ago was a long time, and when Jeff reached out, but what an ideal time to do it. 500 years ago. Let's think about our world here a little bit. Most generations have thought they live in unprecedented times. But think about the mess our world is in. We've just faced a major world-changing event in COVID. Regardless whether COVID was brought death or not, it changed our world. When you have that kind of worldwide disease, and what COVID did more than anything else is create fear and stop travel. Okay, so you have that. We also there is a lot of political struggle going on in our world today. Right now, I don't even want to look at the news in the morning. It's just, Jesus is alive. We have to just keep going forward as his people, regardless which side you're on. So you have this kind of political turmoil. You have this worldwide disease, and we live in an age of we're living in a digital revolution. If you stop and think about the digital revolution we're living in, John Mann, who wrote a book called The Alphabet, says there are 4 turnings in human history. One is with the development of the alphabet. The second is the development of, or when people began to string that alphabet together and create sentences and were able to write. Suddenly you could transmit knowledge in a different way. The third is the printing press, and the fourth is the digital revolution. Think about, for you older people, for us older people here tonight, think about the world prior to the digital revolution. Think about how distant the world was. You had long distance phone calling, even in our lifetime. So you think about, and I think that the generation, the younger people are beginning to ask questions that are really good. Like what is really true? What happens after I die? I hear more of those questions from the younger generation than I did in my generation, I think. So you have this kind of strange mix. Well, so 200 years from now, historians will look back at this time period and say, in the 2020s, those people lived in revolutionary times. In the middle of those times, you normally don't realize it because we're just living our lives. Now, go with me back a cold winter night in Zurich, Switzerland, 500 years ago. Last week, actually, with the Gregorian and Julian calendar change, it's actually January 31st. So last week, 500 years ago, cold, snowy night, Zurich is in a tumult. The political systems of Europe are getting set on their heads. And there's been this invention in the last 100 years in their lifetime that's changed the way they hear about things in their world. The printing press. We have to look, the printing press is probably even more dynamic than the digital revolution in our times. But back to the political system. The political system is being set on its head by smaller principalities saying, wait, how does the emperor and the pope have any power over us? And you have this kind of rise of local nationalized powers. And in the 1300s, it begins this kind of plague that affects Europe. It's called the bubonic plague. It begins in Italy, in an Italian city, when the Mongols invade from the east and they catapult a dead body into a walled city. What they don't know is the dead body is carrying fleas. And these fleas jump off and move around and get on humans, and they carry a disease called the bubonic plague. And from 1348 to 1352, in the span of 4 years, 1/3 of the population of Europe dies. Entire villages disappear. In large populated areas, the largest populated areas are Paris, London, Cologne, Germany, or Cologne. Those are the largest in Western Europe. In some of those places, 60% of the population dies in one season. Now, interestingly enough, violent crime spikes dramatically during those times. Just like COVID. Violent crime spiked dramatically in COVID, if you look at the numbers. Because death, it's cheap. And you have this entire generation of people beginning to ask questions. What's really real? How do I get to heaven when I die? The answers aren't very good. I need better answers. And it's in that world that this group of radicals, well, let's just set the stage. I don't want to give everything away, at the beginning of the talk here, but we need to. Let's back up and say, so, and we'll talk more about each of those four pieces in Europe in a little bit. But it's in this world. See, there's also war brewing, and it's called in German. It's called the Bauerns War, Bauernkrieg, the Farmers' War. We call it the Peasant War. The peasants are kept perpetually poor by the system. The Roman Church, and again, it's easy for us Anabaptists and Protestants to be harsh on the Catholics. We have our own set of problems. We'll look at some of those. A good view of history also looks at the problem areas, and there are some. So 10% of the land in Western Europe is owned by the Catholic Church, and 10% of the people are employed by the church in some capacity. 3% of the people own the land. They're the nobility. They're the lords, the dukes, and the earls. The 87% that are left are peasants. Now, some peasants are wealthier than others. Some have had land holdings that they farm, but ultimately they don't own the land. And the lord and the duke and the earl of your region has complete control of life and death over you. So, who should I pick on? Unlikely target, Jeff. Jeff is the Duke of Berlin. So he owns all the land in Berlin Township. And outside of the control of the church, and there's this tenuous relationship between the political powers, the dukes, the lords, the earls, and the emperor, ultimately ending in the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and the church. Sometimes the church is stronger, sometimes the political systems are stronger. And by the way, there's no large countries. Germany is 430 different principalities. That happens 300 years after that Germany becomes a nation. But so there's all these little pieces. Townships, essentially. And townships are ruled by small, sometimes counties, and there's this kind of power structure in place. So if a peasant has a good year farming, and you feel like they're getting out of control, you just raise the tax. Or the tithe. It's also an interesting time in the religious world. The Catholic Church has struggled for 1,200 years for how to deal with, well, not 1,200 years, 800 years, about how to deal with some issues. Because after Constantine, so the early church begins after Jesus, and you have the development of the church, and then Constantine merges the church and state. I once gave this tour to a group of people, and I talked about Constantine, and somebody said, "Praise the Lord." And I wanted to say, "No, wait a minute, let's not praise the Lord too quick here." So when Constantine legalizes Christianity for the first time in the 300s, 300 years after Jesus, the church and the state merge, and within 75 years, the church and the state are tightly bound, and everyone in the Roman Empire is Christian. So you baptize your babies at 8 days old using the Old Testament rite of circumcision, and they become members of the church and citizens of the state. Now the problem is, not everybody lives Christianly. So you have to come up with mechanisms to deal with people's problems, because ultimately everyone goes to heaven. So you got to deal with what they did on earth to get to heaven, so they come up with purgatory. Now again, some of these practices, it's easy for us to condemn them. Some of them are rooted in really good things. Confession, penance, those kinds of things are good. And they also come up with indulgences, where you go and you make your private confession to the priest. He tells you, say 17 Hail Marys and put an extra $20 in the offering box. The problem is the $20. Because now you've made sin and religion an economic issue. Now, there are really good popes during this time period, but there is also some who aren't quite as good. In the early 1500s, there's a pope named Pope Leo X. He's from the Medici, he's Italian, he's a Medici, a banking family. And he's famous for having a pet elephant, an albino elephant. And every peasant in Europe knew that part of their grain and hay they raised, part of the tithe they paid, went to the church, paid for the Pope's elephant. But they weren't allowed to talk about it. It's why we still today, when there's something in the room and everybody knows it's in the room and no one dares to talk about it, we call it the elephant in the room. Yeah? You've heard that? It comes from back then. So don't think that you're removed from those people. By the way, I discovered this recently. None of you are closely connected enough to the Amish to understand this, but I grew up that if a boy asked a girl to date and she said no, they would say, she gave him the glove. And I could never figure this out. Like, where did you get that saying? Until I discovered that in late medieval Europe, if a knight wanted to court a lady, he would lay his gloves in her path, and if she kept his gloves, that meant she wanted to hold his hand. If she gave it back, she was saying no. The Amish still use that. I mean, it's phraseology. They ate Swiss cheese. So they're people. They're humans, just like us. Well, so Europe is kind of boiling. And Luther has made his mark in Germany, northern Germany, and there's this new young dynamic preacher in the church at Zurich, the Großmünster, the large cathedral. It's a beautiful place. How many of you visited Zurich? Yeah. Going up those steps, they're stone steps, and they're worn in. It's like this. You think about every foot that's going up those steps. In the 1520s, every good preacher, the preacher in Zurich, his name was Ulrich Zwingli, and he's beginning, with the support of the Zurich City Council, he's beginning to move away from the power of the Catholic Church. And suddenly these people are beginning to feel a little freedom. They're beginning to say, we have our man. When it happens in 1519, 17 and 19 in Germany, or in Wittenberg, they look at Luther as their man. But Luther is a little, he doesn't take it as far as the people want him to. And now you have this man in Zurich. Zurich is a forward-thinking, urbane city. It's a beautiful city. It's got a center along the Lamont River, beautiful architecture, and lots of art. But Zwingli begins to clean the church, take the organ out of the church, that's Catholic. Takes the icons out of the church. After all, they worship those things. And he has every good preacher has this group of students who follow him. And Zwingli had a particularly good group of students. One of them was a leading Greek scholar in all of Europe. So if you had questions about your Greek New Testament, you went to see Conrad Grebel. Felix Mons could read and write 5 languages fluently. George Blaurock, by the way, his real name was George von Haus of Joachim. But he always wore a long blue overcoat. And in German you say Überrock, overcoat. So his name is George Blue Rock. Blaurock. George with the blue coat. I love those little stories from history because it makes it real. So anyway, they're good. And then in 1522, it kind of culminates during Lent. Catholic season of Lent, when you're supposed to give up meat. One of the leading citizens in Zurich is a man named Christoph Broschard. He's a printer. And he's capitalized on this printing press, and he's helping spread word. He and Zwingli are tight. And this is Lent, and you're not supposed to eat meat. And in the middle of Lent, Broschard invites some of the leading citizens to his house, and they eat sausage. They call it the sausage-eating incident. In German, you'd say, sie sind die Sausagefresser. Sie sind die Waschfresser. They gobble sausage, literally. And think about what that does to the citizens. When they see, the Catholic Church has had this enormous power over them, and suddenly they feel their freedom. And the peasants are beginning to say, wait, we need to be freed from the constrictions of this world around us that has kept us in perpetual poverty. The political system is corrupt. It's kept us in perpetual poverty. It's in this world that this kind of is beginning to rub. Now, as Zwingli teaches his students, they begin to read the New Testament. And when they read the New Testament, they begin to talk about baptism. And they go to their master and say, Master Ulrich, it is quite clear in the New Testament that we should only baptize people who knows what it means to follow after Jesus. And he said, you're right. You're right. But we can't move too fast because we need the support of the city council. They pay his paycheck and he backs them. Now, we have no concept in the Western world of what the world is like where everybody is bound by one religion. By the way, here's an interesting thing that I've discovered in my reading over the last couple of years. Christian cities in Europe are dirty. They have very little, cleanliness is not a big deal. Actually, cleanliness, taking baths regularly in that world was considered sinful. You suffered by not taking baths. In fact, I read an account of a nun who said the only thing she's ever washed on her body at all is the tips of her fingers, and she was 61 years old. Okay? Yeah! Well, that's not, okay? So European Christian cities are not clean places. The cleanest places in Europe are cities that are controlled by Islam and the Jewish ghettos, because they have different dietary laws, and Islam, until it begins to be radicalized, are actually centers of learning and education and cleanliness. Christianity has been radicalized since the 1100s, when the popes begin to preach these crusader sermons, saying we need to take the Holy Lands back from the Muslim invaders, so they invite their people to go fight for the cause and paint crosses on their shields and banners, and they try to take the Holy Lands back. And in essence, the Pope's Crusader sermons sound so much like the Imam's sermons today in Islam, where you die, you get to bypass purgatory and go directly to heaven. Your sins are, whatever you did, you can be as bad as you want to, you get to go to heaven if you die in the cause. What does that sound like? And so when you radicalize a religion like that, then you have to control every bit of it. And Europe feels controlled, especially the peasants. So in 1522 and 23, this begins to rub in Zurich. And this young group of students begins to push against Zwingli and say the New Testament is actually rather clear about baptism. How can an 8-day-old baby know what it means to follow Jesus? Like I said, he initially agrees with them, but then he backs away from it. And the city council hears about it and become involved. And what is apparent is they felt their power beginning to move away from them. Because if you have an unbaptized infant, it becomes a member of the church, but also a citizen, liable for tax and tithes. And so they feel their power beginning to ebb. And it becomes bigger. It becomes about what is the nature of the church. The baptism is only the point of the Spirit. These group of students begin to say the church should be made up of those who voluntarily choose to follow Jesus, and then they should be baptized. And Zwingli would say, well, how can you ever control anything like that? And Zwingli tells them to stop, or they'll stop the Reformation. They didn't stop. Students do that. You teach them something, they take it the next mile. And they do, and they take it the next mile, and it escalates. And by 1524, the Zurich City Council is done. They can no longer afford. This is turning into a political revolt in the city. The entire city is being affected by it. Actually, they call it infected by it. And it kind of culminates in January 1525. As January 17th, the Zurich City Council makes it criminal to speak about baptism. infant baptism or adult baptism. And if you have an unbaptized infant, by now a number of people did, it becomes a crime. And this group of students gathers together. And again, this is happening not only in Zurich, it's happening all over the German-speaking areas of Europe. And they gather in the home of Felix Manz's mother, somewhere around the 21st of January in 1525, 500 years ago. And somewhere in that middle of that evening, probably on an act of impulse, George, with the long blue overcoat, gets up and says, brothers and sisters, I'd like to be baptized. Now he's with his group of friends, and they say, oh, and the room gets really quiet, and Brother George says, I'm a sinner, and I need to be baptized. And they poke each other, yeah, Brother George, we know. And one of the others goes and gets a water bucket, comes over, and scoops some water onto George's head, and baptizes him. There's actually, Fritz Blanc has found an eyewitness account that wrote about that evening. And he says, George in turn gets up and offers baptism to the others in the room, and 18 of the 21 people accept baptism that night. And then they ordain each other, the three principal leaders, and take the Lord's Supper together. Now think about this. It's not been done in their world. And think about the uproar and the tumult, and word spreads like wildfire through Zurich. And they begin to move on. In the next 8 days, they baptize hundreds of people. In fact, for the next 5 years, in Zurich city circulars or news that's written, more is written about the danger of these people, the Bittelteifel, rebaptizers. And they would say, no, we're not being rebaptized. We were only made wet when we were babies. Now, but word spreads like wildfire. In fact, we have one other eyewitness account, according to Fritz Blanc, a peeping Tom who looked into the windows of a house a couple weeks later and saw people baptizing each other in the house. And he said it's so, and then celebrating the Lord's Supper together, and said it so scared him that his hair stood on end for 4 hours. I've got hair like that too, but anyway. So now back away from that moment a little bit. Actually engage into it and think about the humanness of that moment. Think about the risk that these people took. Think about the world that is so similar to ours. There's probably no time period in history, and I know we've all said this, that is as nearly as similar with the effects of COVID and the digital revolution, the political mess we're in. Regardless which side you're on, there's tumult in our world. And then the questions that people ask out of that. And it's a very similar time period. And the movement, they try to extinguish the movement, and they're never able to. Now, it's also in January 1525, that the peasants revolt. And they call it the pitchfork, sometimes call it the pitchfork revolution. They take pitchfork, they're not allowed to bear swords. So peasants are not permitted to carry swords. Only nobility is permitted to carry swords unless you're a soldier in the nobleman's army, then he issues you a sword. Sword is a sign of upper level. And by the way, the world is so stratified in that time period that there are rules about what you can wear, what you can eat. Peasants weren't permitted to eat roasted meat except on church holidays. You had to eat seethed meat, cooked meat, because that's the poorer choices. Peasant men could not wear pointy-toed shoes. You've seen pictures of men with those pointy-toed shoes in that time period. And I always think you couldn't move very fast, and that's the point. They're noblemen. They don't have to move fast. Somebody else moves fast for them. Peasant women had to wear aprons that went around their hips and had wide ties and were the same color as their dresses. And this is political law. Noble women could wear these frilly little aprons that with very narrow ties. When you look at those, you think they won't keep any dirt out. That's the point. They don't work. Don't need to wear it, okay? I mean, these are political laws in place to keep the people in their proper place. So if you're walking down the street and you meet the Duke of Berlin, you can't speak to him unless he gives you permission. And yet we know in that first baptism in Felix Manz's mother's house that there's nobility and peasants. And so what the authorities feared as much as the religious revolution is the political and social impacts of this. And we can't forget that. And the Anabaptists kind of moved in with the Peasants' War, and sometimes they joined. They weren't as clear. I mean, this is all in a tumult. But yet they begin to say, this is not bringing about the kind of change that we want about following Jesus. And so they begin to speak out against war, and the peasants are roundly defeated. Thousands of them are killed in a battle later that year. And there's so much bloodshed in Europe. And it's in that vacuum that this movement begins to move around. So, I think that when we look at history mechanically, dates and names and things like that, we run the risk of dehumanizing history. And history is full of humans with emotions. They looked and acted like you. They're not superheroes. They're humans. So, when you think about these movements, I think that when we think about history, a clear understanding of history allows us to examine our traditions. There are some things you do at Berlin, there are some things we do at PCF, there are some things we do as Anabaptists that are traditions. And I tell people, especially young people, don't be too quick to replace your traditions, because you always replace them with something else. And is what you replace them with better than what you had? That's a question we should be asking. But a clear understanding of who we are and history allows us to examine our traditions and identify what is valuable and keep that. There is no salvation or saving factor in traditions. There is no saving factor in the story I just told you. It also helps us evaluate current challenges to truth in our world. And we are fortunate to live in the 21st century, where it's clean. You can go home and take a shower. You can wash more than the tips of your fingers. Okay? But it also, when we understand a little bit about the things that their world was facing, and we begin to untangle that, and we begin to see the similarities in our world, it allows us to respond differently. And so I think it's fortuitous that this 500-year anniversary is happening, because I think we actually have something to offer our world as Anabaptists. More than just our stories and our quilts and our straight cornrows and our mashed potatoes. I think we have something to offer. And I think it also gives us a framework. Now, I also think that wisdom comes to the people of God in multiple streams. Wisdom comes to us as a group at Berlin through the moving of the Spirit. But it also comes to us through our cultural context. You're called to live, we are called to live in the 21st century in Holmes County, or Wayne County, or wherever you live. We're called to live here. We're placed here by God to make a difference. We don't live in the 1500s or the 1700s. As a kid growing up, I used to think, oh, if I could just live on the frontier days. I'm really glad I live in the 21st century. Okay? But the place and the time that we're called to live in, I think that the cultural context we're called to live in actually informs us about how we should be responding to issues around us. And then the third thing are living traditions. And I think living traditions, a cappella singing, baptism. Now, they're not on the same stream, but the practices that we have carried for 500 years actually help us engage our world in a different way. I'm not going to spend much time here, except to tell you a really good George Orwell quote. How many of you read George Orwell, 1984? Yeah, you should read it again. Who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future. Okay, think about what he said. He writes these dystopian fiction about a world that's being controlled. So think about when you control the story of your past, you actually are able to control your people. I'm fascinated with the stories that when I tell the story of Behold in the mural, the biggest reaction I get is when we get to Munster. People applaud. You know, the guy who said, praise the Lord when we came to Constantine. He wasn't quite so praising the Lord when we talked about bearing the sword then. You know, he had a few issues then. When we tell the story of Munster, which we'll do here, because you need to know this story. How many of you remember Sam Mullet, the beard cutter from Burkholtz? You know, a guy came around, beat other Amish up, cut their beards off. You know, this story, that's not the first time that happens. In a strange way, it happened in the 1500s in Europe. And it's because we did not learn a lesson that we should have learned. Or Sam didn't. But, and I'm not, I don't think history is cyclical in that history repeats itself. We live in a different time period than they did. We can learn from them. And don't make the mistake of dehumanizing it. These are people whose emotions and feelings are on the surface just like yours are. They fell asleep in church services. They ate. How many of you know what aribula soup is? Aribula soup, you know, the hot milk soup. How many of you know what Amish bread's? Let me tell you a little story. Narita and I were in Dychow twice now. Once with the Hummels and the Troyers, and once before that. The first time we were there, we stayed at a man named Otto Showalter's house. It's a Mennonite church in Germany. And we get to, first of all, we're traveling with a group of young people who sang, and they said, but we'd like a sermon Sunday morning. Would you preach for us? And I said, I can't preach High German well enough, but I can. And he said, just do Pennsylvania Dutch. We understand everything you say. So I get up to preach, and I start, and everybody smiles. And then they giggle. I'm only a paragraph or two in, and I'm thinking, what did I say wrong? There's my button. You know what? And I finally stopped, and I said, what am I doing wrong? Because they just kept laughing. They said, well, we understand everything you're saying, but you're preaching, and they're trying to figure out how to tell me what I'm preaching in. They said, you're preaching in hillbilly Dutch. and it's the stuff the old people talk up in the mountains. So after church service, we go to Otto's house for lunch, Rita and I, and my jaw hit the floor when we got to their house. Because Otto's wife brought us Sunday lunch, and it was bread and cheese and meat and pickled beets and all kinds of spreads. And who else eats that for Sunday lunch? In Holmes County, 30 times a year, every time they have church service. Amish! Yeah! Okay, so it's these cultural pieces. They're humans. And so I asked Otto, I said, is this what you have for Sunday lunch? Every Sunday? And he said, no. He said, I have it every day for lunch. It's called the farmer's lunch. It's easy. And so we brought pieces of culture with us. And we shouldn't be too quick to discount those, because they actually can connect us to the story of God's grace in our people's lives. So this is a map of Europe, of how Europe looked. And I'm going to briefly talk. There are 4 P's, and I'm going to keep coming back to these, because these set the stage for Anabaptism to happen. And if we're right that is how Anabaptism develops, then we actually need to look at our world and say, are these things in play? And if these things are in play, what is God calling His people to do today? And the Reformation, the world in which the Reformation happened, is one where there is tremendous power structure. I've already talked about this. But the political ideal is a unified society under God. Whenever people start talking about a Christian nation, I get alarmed. Because in history, whenever the church and state have united, it's messed up. The church and the power of the gospel. I'm a historian. It's not political commentary. It happens repeatedly because you have something that isn't a power structure embracing a power structure. Because the way of Jesus is not a power structure. The primary weapon that Jesus used to change his world is not power, it's love. It's unselfish love. That's what changes his world. That's how he changed the world. And he calls his followers to imitate him in unselfish love to change their world. So, and the political systems, let me just back up. In the scriptures, when Jesus is tempted of the devil in the wilderness, Satan takes him up to the mountain and shows him all the political powers of the world. And the Greek is particular there, and that means every one of them. Not just the Roman power that they were looking out over, but all of them, including communism and democracy, and says, which one of these do you want to use? And Jesus said, I'm not going to use any of these. So when Christianity or when religion radicalizes and begins to use power, it loses its ability to transform. The world is called to transform. Again, it's not political commentary in the modern state. This is historical. So can a society be governed by a Judeo-Christian ethic? Yes. I like that. I like that. But Christian nations, that becomes problematic primarily because of what's happened in history. But the Holy Roman Empire begins in 800, and it controls all the people. To breach, the nobility and the church said this is the divine blueprint for humanity. And the cityscapes of that time period reflect this. Cathedrals were the highest spires. The next highest building in the city was City Hall. They always had to be lower than the cathedral spires. So even when you looked at the cityscape, when a peasant looked at the cityscape, he saw that those two powers reflected there. And it's why in little villages like Trub and all these church houses have these tremendously high spires. They almost look imbalanced. They're to reflect the power system of the time. There's also, this is not the Dark Ages. I don't like the term Dark Ages because humans live in this time period and they have the same questions that you do. How do I get to heaven? What happens to me after I die? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? How does a true Christian express their piety? And the power structure answered the questions by saying, you go fight in crusades. And if you're really holy, you retreat from the world and join a monastery or a convent. And the idea of purgatory and so on. So there's this deep piety. People are asking these questions. And by the way, this is one of my favorite places in the world. We were up the South Tower. I've been up it twice, 593 steps. This is the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. And our people, the Yoders, the Millers, the Troyers, those people, as they either immigrated or moved through this area, they would have seen this. This was begun in 1200 and finished in 1800. They didn't use the same architect all the way through, by the way. They were remodeling portions of it before it was finished. If you've been in it, it's this massive edifice. It feels cold, and it often is. But there, at the altarpiece, there's gold laid. It's an amazing piece of work. But this reflects the power structure. I talked about the plague. COVID did not kill that many people, but the power of COVID was in the fear it produced. And when you have a worldwide pandemic or anything like that, the fear it produces can produce as much harm as the plague or the disease itself. And so the plague brought the reality of death to the forefront. The average life expectancy in the 1500s in Europe is 42 years old. If you've ever been treated with penicillin and you're alive because of penicillin, you'd be dead. And again, cleanliness and those issues are just big. And then the printing press. And it's wrong to say Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. He didn't invent movable type. He's a goldsmith. Invents movable type. And movable type, you have to put it in a reverse image, up, backwards and in reverse, mirror image. And then it presses. But what it does is it allows for the rapid reproduction of sheets. This is a Gutenberg Bible. I took this picture. I lived 4 blocks from this Bible. I wanted to bring it back to Holmes County and show it around, but they didn't let me. It's in Yale's Rare Book Museum, and there's 13 or 15 of these in the world today. And this is the first large book that Gutenberg printed in the 1400s, the 1430s and 40s. And by the way, he went bankrupt because of the printing press. Interestingly enough, it would have still taken the average person 3 years of wages to pay for this Bible, even with Gutenberg. The literacy rate in Europe is 10%. 10% of people can read. Only 3% can read well enough to read to other people. Vaughn and I love to read. We were comparing, and where's Steve Gowdy? He's gone now. But I was thinking when I was walking up here, you know what a blessing it is to be able to read? Disseminate information. But what the printing press did, by the way, this is an interface of the Gutenberg Bible. The frontispieces, these things here are still hand carved and hand colored. That's what makes them so expensive. But and the different colors are put in later. So it's still an expensive piece to produce. But the power of the press, it was in these little one-page pamphlets, and they look something like this. And they're called Flugschriften, flying words. And what happens is you can reproduce these little pamphlets, church bulletin kind of thing, size. You can reproduce those easily. And these readers, balladeers, would go around and either sing the news or read the news out loud in these little villages. And suddenly peasants who hadn't heard that their world was, sometimes they call it milk travel world. You know people as far as you can carry milk until it starts to sour, which is about 3 to 5 miles. And suddenly they're beginning to hear news. The Turks are invading. Muslim Turks are invading from the southeast. And they begin to hear about Christian armies winning these battles, and their world gets smaller and smaller. And suddenly, it's not just their little village anymore, they're part of something bigger. And what Flugschriften do are bring the world together. Interestingly enough, in 1525, Felix Mons was so bound by this idea that he wrote up his ideas about baptism and had 5,000 of them printed and distributed. So the Anabaptists immediately began to use a printing press. This is Zurich. This is the Grossmünster, where Felix Mons preached. This is the Fraumünster. Frau means lady. Lady cathedral. Doesn't mean the ladies go there, it's a smaller cathedral. So they call it the Fraumünster. And it's in that south tower to the right, you're right, of the Grossmünster, that Grebel and Mons and Blaurock would go up those steps and gather at the top and discuss their wild ideas. And 495 years later, Vaughn and I, and Rita and Inga, I don't know if Bruce and Ann went up those steps, but I went up those steps. I had to pay euros to go up those steps. Maybe bad. I want to go discuss radical ideas with Vaughn at the top, how we're going to take over the world. It's in this world that this happens. It begins around the study of the New Testament, the ideas that Jesus brought when he said, I want you to be my followers. I want you to go and change the world with the kind of unselfish love that I'm giving you. Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. It's as imperfect as if we tried it. Here is the scene of the first baptism. Is it perhaps a little glorified? Yeah, probably. But what we also know is that immediately the authorities begin to hunt down these people. They are dangerous. And they're dangerous because of their religious ideas, but they're almost more dangerous because of their social and political ideas. The church not bound to one entity, the church being able to cross national boundaries, and peasants and nobility kneeling together and serving the Lord's Supper together. Oh! Who's going to keep these people in their place? A year and a half later, by the way, Conrad Grebel was the son of a Zurich City Council member. And he was married, his wife took the children and left him when he was rebaptized. And he died a year and a half later when he contracted the plague, alone. These people didn't think, I wonder what our legacy will be. That is a first world problem to think about legacy. They simply followed in the route that they felt Jesus called them to follow. George Blaurock and Felix Mons had been in prison a couple weeks after that first baptism, but they were able to escape. And in December of 1526, they came back into Zurich to preach. Now, by now, they're very well known. Mons has baptized thousands of people in St. Gallen. In one day, in a village, they're not quite sure about the number, how to transcribe the number. It's either 300 or 800 people he baptized in one day. And again, this is political and social, but it's also tied with the Peasants' Revolt. And they sneak back into Zurich to preach and to meet some of their brothers and sisters there. And they're recaptured. This time they're held in secure prison. And on January 5th, 1527, almost 2 years to the date of that first baptism, the Zurich City Council condemned Felix Mons to be tied up with his hands bound together, slipped over his knees, and a stave put between his hands and knees so he couldn't, and an executioner hired by the city rowed him out into the middle of the river along the fish bridge, and in a particular cruel manner said, "You made the choice to be baptized with water that first time. We're going to baptize you with water the second time." And they held him underwater until he drowned. And while that's happening, his mother, who had opened her home that night, stood on the banks of the river and encouraged her son to be faithful, because it'd be worth it. It takes a lot of courage for a mother to do that. George Blaurock was not a citizen, so they beat him to the city limits. And he kept on preaching, but 2 years later he's recaptured and burned at the stake. The average life expectancy of an Anabaptist leader in the first 50 years of Anabaptism, from the time of their being called to be a leader to the time of their death, is 2.5 years. So they bullseyed the leaders, but they couldn't stop the movement. And I believe that the movement, what it did is it appealed to the nobility. There's nobility who joined. There's former Catholic priests and nuns in areas where Protestantism takes over, or not even Protestantism. A few years later, this alcoholic, womanizing monk or a priest from Friesland would join the movement. His name is Menno Simons. And so you have this kind of strange mix of people together. And maybe they're 200 years ahead of their time or 300 years ahead of time because they begin to call for the separation of church and state, and that the church has the power to make those choices from within. Our time is almost up. That's again, I'm not trying to romanticize this movement. This movement is as messy as any other movement because it's filled with humans. And we'll talk about some of that. But for the first night, this is how it begins. This is a world in which it rises up. Zwingli says, dealing with the Catholics is child's play as compared to dealing with these dreaded Anabaptists. You know, I kind of want that testimony today, but I don't want the price that goes with it sometimes. There's a tremendous price that they pay. Questions? I'll hang around a bit. If you have questions, you may. I need to deal with the press.
So,
Dave, yeah. Lord
so how you have all these this educated Bible study, and then they're kind of killed off.
Yeah.
And then it kind of, and maybe you'll get to this next week, but I mean, I think of Mennonites and Anabaptists as kind of rural, like farming, right?
So it spreads in cities. The initial movement is urban. Now, it's also true that there are other places where they're baptizing. We kind of like to focus on the Zurich one, but there are other places. It's coming up, and it's flavored. Some of them use the sword, some don't. And in the end, 10, 15 years down the road, after this debacle at Munster, they kind of make some, they look at that. So this issue of literacy, the scriptures, it is initially the movement feeds off of, it grows the fastest in areas that have moved away from the Catholics into the Protestant circles, which left a whole bunch of monks and nuns and priests who didn't have church roles anymore, and many of them joined this movement. Michael Sattler, Margarita Sattler, many of them joined this movement. But within 20 years, the movement is much more rural. And in many cases, they're led by pastors who are either don't have good literacy rate or are illiterate. But they begin to focus on a particular portion of Scripture, the Gospels, and most churches, most Anabaptist congregations don't have, no one has, not nearly every family has a Bible. In some cases, they have one Bible to share, or a part of the Bible to share, and so they cut it up. And I know of one case where an Anabaptist preacher who couldn't read had someone read to him, and he memorized the largest part of the Gospels. So they compensate. They look at it. So character, but a desire to follow Jesus becomes kind of, and they very quickly say we have to choose our leaders from within. Yeah, Bob.
I think part of the humanist too is recognizing that you choose to follow something that is radical or on the margin.
Yeah.
You are choosing to have your name be drugged through the dirt,
Yeah.
and you will lose standing.
Yeah.
Whether it could be job, position, and it's hard to. So like Swingley, he couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I can't stand out because I don't want to be labeled as such. And I think we today face that same.
Oh my God.
And I also think that if we were, I hope we never do, but if the U.S. were to ever be engaged in a serious major war, suddenly it's not popular to be those Amish or Mennonite.
Yeah.
During World War I and II is very, very unpopular.
Exactly. And I'm going to keep talking about this, but the peasants saw it as a movement that would bring them freedom. But many of them left when it didn't bring them the economic and political freedom that they sought. And the leaders and the movement argued that true freedom is found when you're willing to follow someone like Jesus. That's where true freedom is found, so it doesn't matter your station in life. But you're right. It's like these people are cursed in Europe. They upset the power balance. They actually show up in America when the Puritans moved to New England. They cannot stand the Quakers. So the Pilgrims and Puritans moved to Boston, the Quakers moved to Pennsylvania. The Puritans and Pilgrims cannot stand the Quakers, because the Quakers believed in the freedom, separation of church and state. So some Quakers preached their way north. And the Puritans in Boston caught them and hung them. This is the United States, the colonies, in the late 1600s, hung them. And they said, if we don't hang them, New England will become what Europe was under the dreaded Anabaptist. And so, yeah, these are real questions. Yes, Dave?
So I get a sense that the early leaders during this movement that were against this movement definitely wanted to squelch what was going on.
Yes.
So when these Anabaptist leaders were killed, did that deter the movement at all, or did it inflame the fires?
Sure. There's this kind of old quote that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the, or whatever. Martyrdom is never good. Killing people is never good. And did it deter? It slowed the movement down. Yeah. Now, it self-destructs. The movement self-destructs, which is either next week or the following week. The movement self-destructs at Munster. And it changes the flavor from there. But
I don't want to ruin any surprises. So
yeah,
good stuff.
No, it's a part of the story.
Yeah.
So it does. Yes, it slows it down, and particularly it slows it down with people who are seeing it as a way for economic and political freedom. Now, the movement is economic and political. They would have actually said, if you have money, you share it. If you're wealthy and you have money, you share it. You have to share it, or else you're not a true follower of Jesus. And so there's much more economic, and they wrestle with this in the East. They really wrestle with it. They become Hutterites. But, yeah.
So there was a strong social pressure.
Yeah. The movement is social. It always is. It affects every piece of your life. Other questions? Yes.
This might not be a question so much as a confession.
Okay, good.
I have always very proudly seen Grable monks and Blaurock as my spiritual forerunners.
Yeah.
But if I'm honest enough, I'm probably more inclined towards Zwingli to be cautious in this movement than to jump ahead, to run ahead like our Anabaptist forerunners.
Yeah, I've often, as a historian, I've studied this stuff for a long time, and I'm always thinking, would I join the movement or not? And my wife and I'm a rule follower. And I went to the ER this fall, and I was in no shape to walk in across the ER parking lot, but it said ambulances only and parking's over here, so I parked over there and crawled my way across the parking lot. Okay, I'm a rule. Okay, so I would have struck like, I tend to think, well, we'll work within the confines of the system. And they broke the confines of the system. So yes, I admire them, but boy, they're radical. The movement is known as Teufel in German, or Swiss German. Teufel means baptizers. And then Wiedertäufel, rebaptize. And when you translate that into Anabaptist, Anna means again in Greek, re. It's not, we have to teach people who come to this community that's not anti-Baptist. We're not out to get all the Southern Baptists. No, it's re-baptizers. They would have said, no. This is our first baptism. We were only made wet when we were babies. So, yeah. The radical movement. Time's up. We'll be back next week. Have a great week. Enjoy the freezing rain tonight. Think about it, this would be a good night to meet out in secret.